So record to connecting file server. There we go. All righty then. Hello everyone. My name is. Let's do some spotlighting here. Not going.
Hi, all.
All righty, everyone. I'm Richard with the Titanic Book Club, and we are here with author of the book on the Carpathia, and her name is Ludowyke. Did I get that correct?
You got it very close, Ludowyke.
Ludowyke. Okay. That's a really interesting one. So anyway, I'm just going to let you take it away and talk about your book for a few minutes, and then we'll have some questions and see if anybody else wants to chime in, if that's acceptable to you.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, let me pop you on the spotlight and we'll go. All right, you're on.
Thanks, Richard. And thanks for inviting me along. I first connected with Jill when I did an Instagram interview for the Titanic Memorial Lighthouse in New York, and I hadn't heard of the Titanic Book Club before, and I'm always delighted to get asked along to talk about something I'm passionate about, which is the Carpathia. So a little bit about me. I'm an author and academic. I live in Australia. I have published under my legal name and pen name. So I've published novels, academic papers, journal articles, and my area of expertise is actually narrative. So my degree is in a Doctor of Creative Arts, specializing in written communication. And Carpathia was actually the book that I wrote for my doctoral dissertation. So that's how it all came about. I was actually watching an episode of Antiques Roadshow, which is a program that I love. And someone had brought along a medal awarded to one of the crew members who served aboard Carpathia. And the experts started to tell the story of this ship that had raced to the rescue of Titanic through pitch black night, iceberg infested waters, and at the time, gave some very wild claims about the speeds that Carpathia reached, which I now know are untrue. But at the time, it just captured my interest, and I wondered why I'd never heard such a heroic story in contrast to what is probably the most famous maritime tragedy of the 20th century. So unlike many of you, I'm sure, who've had a long passion for all things Titanic, you're in a book club devoted to the ship. I sort of came to it in a roundabout way as a writer who found a story that she was passionate about. And when I saw that episode of Antiques Roadshow, I grabbed my iPad and I started to look up this ship, Carpathia. And I found that she had this really fascinating history all the way through from when she was built, when she saved the survivors of the Titanic, through to her use in the First World War. And at the time, I was looking for a subject to write about for my doctoral dissertation, something that I was passionate about. And I had a few ideas that I mooted to my supervisor. And this one, I remember I wrote an email to him and I said, oh, here's idea one, here's idea two. And by the way, I just happened to have this other idea about writing this story of a ship, but I think there'll be so much historical research involved, which will actually be aside from the topic of my dissertation. So the topic of my research was actually about artifact narrative, so creative nonfiction about historical objects, so how you can write about inanimate objects in a way that enlivens them. So that was the research component, and then all the historical research that I did to write the book was on top of that. But as ideas tend to do, once they grip you and they don't let go to you, and the more I thought about it and the more I realized that there just weren't a lot of works written on Carpathia, that I thought this is something that would be complementary to the story that already exists, that we know so well, the history of this ship. So that's sort of a little bit about me and how I came to write this book when I didn't have that sort of lifelong interest that had compelled me to write this story, as I know is what kind of compels a lot of people who end up writing, I think, about the Titanic or maritime history. I sort of came into it as a newcomer, which which meant I had a big learning curve.
Yeah, I bet. Especially since there's a whole new language that comes with the secret language of boats and ships is completely uh,
I'll tell you a funny story, Richard. So I know exactly what you mean. When I started to do my background reading for writing this story, and I was reading all of these books with maritime terminology, I had a dictionary in one hand and the reference book in my other hand, and I was looking up all of these nautical terms. And I remember, this is how green I was at the time, I had to look up the word screw because I kept seeing reference to these twin screw or triple screw ships. And I was like, what does that actually mean? So then, and that's just not in your standard dictionary. I had to go to the Oxford English Dictionary. And as soon as I realized it was a propeller, it made perfect sense. But just learning the parts of the ships and the different names of the ships and being able to, read the shipbuilders' plans and all those kinds of things, and even geography. So Carpathia, I remember I was reading about some of her Mediterranean voyages, and I actually had to go and get myself an atlas because living in Australia, I'm very familiar with the southern hemisphere, but less familiar with the northern hemisphere. I mean, I know the places, but actually, when you're trying to map the route of a ship through names of places that you kind of know the location of, I mean, I had to just go and do that. So there was right from start to finish, there was a lot of research involved, and the book actually took, so the doctoral, I wrote as part of the doctoral dissertation. As I said, it took 4 years to do. So, but that's where I started out, having to look up everything.
oh, that's funny because there's so many different. Not only do you have a standard term that everybody uses, but you also have alternative terms that flow in there too. So, um, for instance, propeller, screw, but you also have the term wheel used as well, which can get confusing because you also have the wheel, the helm, which is your steering wheel, as opposed to the wheel propeller. And yeah, it's just, it took me a long time and I'm still learning. So, all righty, let's dig into this. When did you first hear about Carpathia?
So that was during that episode of Antiques Roadshow where they had told that story of the ship based on the medals that the survivor had brought along. And I remember that I thought it was such an intriguing story, and I couldn't understand why I'd never heard of Carpathia when Titanic was so famous. And I'm sure that, I mean, I'm sure there are people out there that have heard of this ship, but, you know, 25-year-old me, not the right generation, hadn't grown up with an interest in maritime history, had heard this story for the first time and started to ask these questions about this ship and this story, because it was that story that captured me, that romantic and heroic element in the face of all that tragedy.
Okay. Uh, why do you think the Carpathia is relatively unknown when the Titanic is so famous? I mean, all of us here in the book club, we're pretty used to the everything, the ship and everything else. But I mean, for your average uh, person on the street that only really knows the ship through the Cameron movie, um, I wish they would have dealt on that more. But yeah, why is Carpathia relatively unknown when Titanic is so famous?
Yeah, you're right. It's very much the audience that you talk to that dictates whether or not the ship is unknown. I'll often go and do talks on Carpathia to local community groups or anyone that wants me to come and talk about it, essentially. And I'll sometimes start with the question, hands up if you've heard of Carpathia, and I might have 20% of hands in the audience go up, maybe 30%. And then I'll ask, hands up if you've heard of Titanic. And then every hand in the place shoots up. So if you haven't grown up with that interest, then not knowing the name of the ship, I think, is quite common. But I think that's a consequence of the enormity of the tragedy of Titanic actually overshadowing the story of the rescue. Because if you go back to 1912 and you look at the historical records, Carpathia was incredibly famous at the time. Everybody knew the ship's name, and well, obviously after the rescue occurred, and it gave Captain Rostrum fame for the rest of his life, and the Carpathia became, you know, this ship that had been intrinsically linked to a tragedy that sort of redefined maritime history and was one of those events that sort of separates the world from all that golden age that occurred prior to the First World War and the close of the Edwardian period. So during that time, she was incredibly well known, but 100 years have passed, and in those 100 years, what people remember is the mythos of the tragedy. So they remember sort of that that element that it was the world's largest ocean liner on its maiden voyage, sunk by an iceberg, and all those lives lost, as opposed to the story of the ship that actually went to the rescue. During the resumed voyage to the Mediterranean after she delivered the survivors to New York, there were reports that more than 100,000 people came to visit Carpathia at those ports. So, and one thing that I in my research I've looked for, but I've not been able to find. I've seen newspaper references to silent films that were actually formed, a silent film that was actually made about Carpathia, like sort of a documentary. And I don't know how many people actually know about it, because I haven't seen it in any of the written resources, but I've seen it in this news report, and I've looked for it, and I've contacted the sound and film archives over there in the US, but apparently there's a lot of material from that period that's actually gone missing. So she was famous. She's just been forgotten in the last 100 years, except by those people who have that specific interest in this topic.
Okay, I'm gonna just jump in here for a minute, because you hit on something that was very interesting. We all know now that Titanic, the images, the pictures, everything, a lot of film that is attributed to Titanic is actually of the Olympics. And just your personal opinion, some of the pictures that are purporting to be Carpathia, how do you think that images could have been switched, or they could have just grabbed another
Yeah,
ship
they
that
did.
kind of looked like that to do a documentary about if they couldn't do the real ship?
But the documentary was done on so the silent film one, that was actually done on Carpathia, I'm fairly certain. But absolutely, they did grab footage of Saxonia and Ivernia. So they were sort of the half sisters, as you say. But you can actually see some footage of Carpathia in various things. So I've seen footage from one of the war memorials of Carpathia actually painted in dazzle, and you can actually see the name of her on it. But I have seen, so some of those clips that you see that have been made that show the scenes of Carpathia steaming towards New York. No, those they've kind of cobbled things together, and you see images of Captain Rostrum on the dock and the crew members, and then sort of people around, gathered on the dock. So those images are correct, but the ones of Carpathia steaming that you actually see, it's the complete wrong time of day. It was taken during the daytime, and Carpathia arrived in New York at night. So the images themselves, some of them, it's really hard to tell because the quality of what ship it actually is, but you can kind of logic out that if a footage is taken during the daytime of a ship arriving with survivors that arrived at nighttime, then it's not actually accurate. But yeah, I am not an expert in being able to compare, as some people can look at an image and so the same way they verify a shipwreck, for example, they'll go to the builder's plans and they'll compare specific features, and they'll have to get a certain number of matches to say that this ship is this shipwreck. I'm not an expert in that. So when I look at a photo of Carpathia, I've got to carefully study it. And then there are instances where I'm just not good enough to be able to tell. And then there are instances where I can tell, and where I do know that they used either images of Saxonia or Ivernia. And so I've been to the Sydney Jones Library at the University of Liverpool, which holds the Cunard archives. Even in the Cunard archives, where they take photographs for posterity of ships, I've seen images of Saxonia and Invernia, the interiors that are labeled as Carpathia's interiors. And I know that they're not, because I've seen images that are verified for Carpathia. So there is those instances where, similar to Olympic and Titanic, where they've just used the two ships interchangeably, the same thing has happened.
Okay. I'm going to put two questions together here. How dangerous was the rescue mission? And how far away was Carpathia from Titanic? Because those kind of questions kind of intertwine together.
I'm sure a lot of you actually already know the answers to some of these,
We
but
we we do, but we do have a lot of new people that come in, and this information is really good to share.
well, they're
Share with
interesting
them.
stories as well, so they're worth chatting about. So the first question about how dangerous was it? It was dangerous. In fact, Captain Rostrom later said that if he had realized how much ice was about, he would not have steamed full speed ahead. So it was a very dangerous thing to do. You have to remember there are several factors. They'd had ice reports. They knew that there was ice. They didn't know how much ice. And this construction of Carpathia is different to Titanic, which was, even though she sank, she was a more modern ship, and she was built in a way that was supposed to be watertight. If her hull was breached, Carpathia wasn't built like that. So if Carpathia had struck an iceberg, there was none of this, well, the ship should be able to stay afloat until help came. If that had happened, then their only recourse, obviously if the damage was severe enough, was to abandon ship. So so they're in a boat that is not as modern. It's not it's not practically unsinkable. They're heading full speed ahead towards icebergs, and the precautions that they can take are essentially only putting out extra watches and trying to keep an eye out for icebergs, and the conditions that night were not conducive to spotting icebergs. And if you look in Rostrom's testimony at the American inquiry, you'll actually see it's it's brief, but they actually talk about almost colliding with an iceberg themselves. So they had to alter course several times, and then I think Bizet, if memory, in Bizet's James Bizet's memoirs, he talks about it as well, if I recall correctly, that they almost had their own encounter with an iceberg. So yes, it was dangerous. Ships during that time, they expected to encounter ice during their voyages, but that's why the North Atlantic tracks were where they actually were, supposedly out of the range of ice, and they were heading directly towards it. They're a ship at sea with help potentially hours away, racing towards a dangerous situation, pitch black night, lots of icebergs that could potentially sink them in a ship that is not built to withstand a collision the way the more modern ships were actually built to withstand them. And I recall I think it was his memoirs, Captain Rostrom actually said, when they arrived at the rescue site, it was still dark. That dawn hadn't broken until they picked up the first boatload of survivors. And when it did, they were astonished by how much ice was about. So much so that, he sent one of the junior officers to the top of the wheelhouse and he said, count how many icebergs are between 150 and 200 feet tall. And the junior officer came back and he reported that there were more than 25 icebergs over 200 feet and dozens more between 150 and 200 feet. And as you know, most of an iceberg's mass is actually under the water. So, and that's just what they could see around them. Those were the biggest ones, not all of them, just the biggest ones. So, yes, it was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. But, it's also this idea that when ships are in trouble at sea, the only other, during this time period, the only hope that they have are other ships coming to their rescue. So it was dangerous, but Captain Rostrom didn't realize how dangerous until after the fact. And he did reflect on that whether he would have made all of those decisions, he hasn't said I would do this differently, but he has said that he would think um, more carefully about going full speed into those conditions. And as for the distance between Carpathia and Titanic, this is actually one of excuse me, my favorite stories, because when I watched that episode of Antiques Roadshow, right at the start of this journey, I recall that the expert had told how Captain Rostrom had turned off steam to all non-essential services, so the passengers' lighting and heating, and they diverted that steam back into the engines, trying to wring out every drop of speed that they could from Carpathia in the hope that they would get there as quickly as they possibly could. And the expert at the time on that episode had said that Carpathia had attained these incredible legendary speeds, and these speeds of over 17 knots had attached themselves to the story of Carpathia and sort of become intrinsically ingrained in it. And the reason for that was because Captain Rostrom testified that the ship had made those speeds during, I think it was the British inquiry that he gave the speeds. And obviously, this is before GPS. So he calculated that using, dead reckoning, distance, time, and speed. He knew the coordinates Carpathia was at when they received the distress call, knew the coordinates that they had received in the distress call, and he knew how long it took him to travel that distance. So he calculated that they were 58 miles away from Carpathia. In fact, I've actually got, am I able to share my screen? Is that
Um,
right? I don't know if I have that. Let me see if I have that function. Okay, so you
give-
disabled. That's okay.
oh, no,
So
No, Richard can give you
do it.
co-host. Give
Yeah,
her
give me a
co-host.
second. Let me get in, and I will.
so while let me know when that function's available, because I have a map that.
Give it a try.
Give it a try.
That's
Okay,
awesome.
I can do. Okay, let me just grab. I've got I pulled open the presentation that I usually give when I'm doing public talks on this, and it's got the map that my publisher did for the front of my book, which actually shows locations on it. Oh, here it is. So
Wow, awesome interview so far.
let's see. Excuse me. And share this. There it is. Okay. So you can see, and I'm sure you've all seen lots of maps, being enthusiasts on this subject, but you can see where Carpathia was and where Titanic was, and Captain Rostrom, knowing the distance that he thought he traveled between these 2 points, calculated that speed of over 17 knots, and that's what he reported. And because that was in all of the historical sources for decades, it appeared in all of the secondary sources as well. So you'll actually read a lot of sources that actually report that speed, that legendary speed that she seemingly attained. But there are problems with this when you start to research into Carpathia. She was built as a steamer, a 14-knot steamer. And it's kind of like, if you think of an analogy of a car, there's only a theoretical speed that a car can attain. It doesn't matter how much gas you put in, it doesn't matter how hard you press the accelerator. It can't exceed speeds more than it's actually capable of. And at the time, I mean, the difference between 14 knots and 17 knots didn't seem like a lot to me. But the more I read into this, and I like reports by people who are maritime engineers and who have studied this issue, have said, the idea that a ship that was actually built for one speed can actually achieve those that 14 knots can actually achieve 17 knots is actually not actually possible based on her specifications. But more convincingly, I suppose, is the fact that in 1985, Robert Ballard, of course, discovered the wreck of Titanic. And we know now that the position that she was found in is actually different to the position that was reported in that distress message that Harold Cottam received aboard Carpathia. And there's actually a 13-mile difference. So if you do that same distance, speed, time calculation, you have to change the distance from 58 miles to 45 miles, sorry. So that's actually that's the distance that was between them. So you'll read a lot of reports that actually inaccurately say it was 58. But and who talks about? I think there's actually one of the articles in the Centennial Reappraisal, so SS Titanic, a Centennial Reappraisal. I think they talk about the speed in detail, and so the issues that actually exist with that reported speed and the distance between the two ships and the ground that Carpathia actually covered. So it was one of those things. I remember I was thinking, oh, this ship, we put the steam back. They put the steam back into the engines and they pushed her as fast as they possibly could, and then they attained this speed that she'd never before achieved, and that attached to the legend. But like so many things with Titanic, the myth gets perpetuated because there's something inherently what's the word that I want, attractive about this idea of a legendary speed that had never been attained before. But the reality is, yes, they did absolutely everything they could to wring extra speed out of the ship. They did divert the steam back to the engines. They did put on extra watches of, stokers, but we'll never know the exact speed that she actually attained. But more realistically, it was not 17.5 knots, as Rostrom reported. And it wasn't that he did not believe that. He did believe that, absolutely, because using the systems that they had at the time, that's all that they knew. It wasn't until 1985 that they discovered Titanic, and people actually began to realize, well, the distance Carpathia covered was actually much shorter than had been known through all the previous decades, that this kind of emerged. But because it's still in all those history books, it's not as well known to the general population.
I had a question that popped up on the screen from Alicia. She was wondering if where can we find the photos of Carpathia in dazzle paint? You don't happen to have one.
I have the footage. Let's see. I might be able to. Just give me a second. I'm going to stop talking for just a second, and I'll look for it, because I do have it, and I'm happy to play that if we just give me a second to find it.
Okay, I'll let you look, and I'm just going to make a comment on the fact that each ship that is built has a maximum hull speed, and there's a very complicated mathematical formula that is used to calculate, such as the length between perpendiculars, which are the bow and stern posts there, the horsepower, draft, weight, everything like that. And once you get up to the hull speed, it is darn near impossible to push it faster. And if you want to push it faster, your power required actually goes up exponentially. So it's really like a hockey stick. Once you hit that one point, you can't. It just doesn't happen. I mean, you could put 1 million horsepower behind it. Yeah, sure, but I had to do some calculations on that on the Queen Mary, because people were saying that she could go a lot faster, and we were doing some argument. It's like, no, you can only get so. That's it. So.
Thank you. Yes. So, and that's an example of, I understand that the idea of the ship having a maximum speed, but I don't understand all the technical reasons for that. So thank you very much, Richard, for that.
Just for people to know, the longer the ship, really, the faster she can go. So some of these large aircraft carriers getting up to 30 knots is entirely possible. It's just because they have the horsepower and they've got the length of the hull. So I had a friend that had a 32-foot cocktail cruiser that was built in 1928 with a displacement hull, and it could only get up to 9 knots, and that was the most you could push it. So yeah, there is definitely that. Okay, are you ready?
Okay, yes, I am. So I found it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pop in the details in the chat box with a link to where this is. Because it's online, I'm comfortable showing it to you, because there's some things, some research and things that I can't just show because I sign things when I go to archives that state I'll only use it for personal research. But because this one is online, I'm going to post the link and the name of so it's The Way of a Ship on the Sea. It's from the Imperial War Museum. And there you can find a link to this. So if you go there, you should be able to get a copy as well. But I'll show it to you here because it is freely available online.
Awesome.
So give me 1 second and I will go back and share my screen. Oh, hold on a second.
Technology, it works great when it works, right?
Well, I just had to, I had to actually press the button on the PowerPoint presentation. So, okay, you can see that now?
Yep.
Okay. So you have to watch closely when it comes up, but you can actually see Carpathia written on the hull. I'll pause it when we get to that point.
By the way, I love the dazzle camouflage. It's so wacky, but yet it works. And for those of you not knowing, it is supposed to break up the ship's silhouette so they can't tell where it's.
So can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Yeah, so just watch this section here. I've paused it and it's a little hard to see, but I'll press play again, but you'll see her name.
Oh yeah, there it is.
That's a
So-
whole angle of looking at her too that we've never seen. I don't
Yeah.
think.
So there's a Facebook group and RMS Carpathia Facebook group, and someone had posted in there. And so this film is actually quite long. It's something like 20 minutes long. So the person who spotted it, eagle eyes, and they posted it. And because I saw this for the first time after I'd actually written the book, I hadn't seen it before that. And it's some of the best and closest footage that I've actually seen of Carpathia, and I'd never seen her in Dazzle before, but yes.
That's great.
Yeah, that dazzle camouflage is so fun to look at, but it did break up the ship's silhouette and confuse the submarines, so they didn't know which way it was going. They put fake bow waves on there to make them think it was going faster.
And I found out so much, and just the idea of like ships, convoys traveling in a zigzag formation. I learned a lot about when I studied. I was particularly interested in the story of Carpathia's own end, so I had to do some research on that, and also obviously her use as requisitioned by the Admiralty during the First World War. And yeah, I learned a lot about that. Interestingly, I remember I read in a newspaper article, possibly the New York Times, that she was the first armed merchant ship to arrive in New York, and caused a little bit of a furor at the time because she was a merchant ship. She wasn't a military vessel. But when she, when the Admiralty, I've lost the word that I wanted. Yes, thank you. That's one. When the Admiralty requisitioned her, and they fitted her out with armed her. When she came to New York, she was the first armed merchant vessel to actually arrive in New York. So there was a whole news article on it, and the only vessel that was actually armed in the convoy where she ended up being sunk as well.
Okay, I have an interesting question, and I know what was here. Most of us all know how many people were saved and how many died on Titanic, but did anybody pass away from the people that were saved on Carpathia?
Yes. So what happened was the survivors in the lifeboat, particularly the ones in the collapsible who had been in the water and were hypothermic. There were several who actually succumbed to hypothermia while in the lifeboats, and 3 bodies were actually brought aboard Carpathia from the lifeboats. There were actually some bodies that were still left in some of the damaged boats that were abandoned, but 3 arrived on Carpathia while 3 corpses arrived and were brought aboard Carpathia, and 1 person died aboard Carpathia. William Lyons, and I've forgotten his surname. I can find it if anyone wants. I just off the top of my head, I can't quite remember his surname. So he died while aboard Carpathia, yes. But that was the only death that occurred aboard the ship, and that was a combination of hypothermia and likely crush injuries.
Horrible. Okay, now let's get into the voyage a little bit. Let's ask, well, Alicia just asked a great question. And I don't know if you can see it, but I'm going to grab it while I can.
Yes, so I do see. So do I know anything about Carpathia carrying illegal immigrants, causing her to be fined and taken for the war? I'm not quite sure what you mean by taken for the war. There were instances where Carpathia, so when ships carried immigrants, there were certain regulations that they had to conform to, which included having, it was they either had to get permission or pay a cost to governments of the countries where they were actually bring those immigrants from. And Canard received fines for basically not having the right paperwork, essentially. So when you say illegally carrying immigrants, it wasn't, don't get the idea that they were trying to smuggle immigrants. It was that she didn't have the correct paperwork, and I can't remember exactly the dates that this occurred, but it was more a kind of a bureaucracy issue rather than the idea of carrying illegal immigrants, although technically because they didn't have the right paperwork, they were illegal. And so yes, she did receive fines for this, but that didn't have anything to do with her being taken for war. So I'm not quite sure when you say taken for war, whether or not that's a separate question. So maybe if you could give me some clarification. But this was not during war times. So this was, I can't quite remember the year, but it would have been prior to that, because she ended up sinking in the First World War. And by that time, the immigrant trade, that she was being used by the Admiralty to carry troops at that time.
Yeah, well, the Admiralty just basically requisitioned anything and everything they could. And
yeah, because they had subsidies with so they had the subsidies with Canard, which allowed Canard to survive in the face of competition from the International Mercantile Marine, which were pretty much trying to take over the North Atlantic and acquire most of the shipping lines of the time. But because of those subsidies, Canard had agreements in place that during times of war, they could actually use those ships as unarmed merchant vessels. So I hope that answers your question.
That was especially true with, a lot of people don't realize that International Mercantile Marine was actually an American company.
Yes.
So that's where a lot of that resentment came in, because they didn't want Cunard snapped up and to lose their,
they just, I mean, Cunard was one of the last British holdouts. They had and that's why I think there was so much support from the government to retain Cunard as a British enterprise because of that. So yeah, and I think it was it John Pierpont Morgan, who was from the IMM, the same gentleman who was the railroad baron and decided that he would like to also control the North Atlantic the way he controlled the railway in the United States.
Yeah, and the subsidy there, Lusitania and Mauritania were built because of that. A lot of people don't realize that they actually had the military power plants. They had basically battleships.
Yes,
the
Admiralty had a lot to say about the plans for those ships, because the intention was that those ships would if the Admiralty had to requisition them, the intention was that they would be able to be retrofitted to be armed merchant vessels that were capable of great speeds, essentially. So the Admiralty actually had a lot to say during the building of those particular ships. Oh, I see some questions coming through.
Yeah, you feel free to jump into those if you see them.
Yes. Okay. So Jill asks, can I please tell everyone why I choose to refer to Carpathia as Thea? I think some were wondering. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that's important to understand that I approached writing a book about Carpathia as a writer telling an extraordinary historical story, but also as a doctoral student writing in an area that I was researching. And the area that I was researching was writing nonfiction about historical objects, but in ways that enliven the object. So if you think about it this way, when you walk into a museum and you see a historical artifact and you experience a sense of connection to the past, a sense of nostalgia, an idea that what you are viewing has borne witness to perhaps some extraordinary events, and as a result it sort of acts as almost a conduit between you and the events and the people of the past. And that idea of what an object represents when you see it in person is something that I wanted my readers to feel. And one of the ways that I chose to do that was to use a technique that writers call literary animism. Now, if you're familiar with animism, it's actually a worldview that believes that objects and of both the natural and the man-made world are imbued with physical essence. It's a metaphysical spirituality, if you will. Now, whether or not you believe in animism, that's where the idea comes from. Literary animism is about the techniques that we as writers use to try and make you experience that connection with an object as more than simply an inanimate object, as that idea of it connecting you to the past. And when I wrote Carpathia, I was very aware that, as far as I'm concerned, she's the main character in my book. She's not just the ship that I'm writing about. So during this time period, most of the other characters are actually men, just because of the time period. And also, if you look at the modern sections of the book, so I didn't actually mention this, the book is told in two timelines, a historical and a contemporary timeline. And the contemporary timeline follows the search for Carpathia's wreck and a team that dives that wreck. But that modern and historical timeline, what I actually wanted to do in the historical timeline was craft that connection to the ship. And so I thought about what I could actually do to achieve that connection for readers, and also remember, again, audiences, for you who have had a lifelong love for this topic, you know this ship as Carpathia. That's what she is. So if you sort of read Thea and you're like, well, why does she call it Thea? And you don't actually like it. And I get both. I get readers who don't like it and readers who do like it. But overwhelmingly, what I think is the readers who don't like it are those who already know Carpathia, already know the history, and already have a love for this subject. Whereas the other readers are that kind of go, oh, so it's Carpathia, but it's Thea. And there's this sense of, this ship as an actual character in the book. And those readers are the ones that, and that's probably actually most of my readers, I'm going to be honest, because my book will be read by enthusiasts, but it'll also be read by a very wide audience of people who just like the story and want to learn more about it. And those people who are not necessarily coming with that same love and knowledge of the background, that kind of get that sense of connection from the ship because of the techniques that I've used. So the animism, the personification, and that sense of that she's more than just an inanimate object. And I mean, I'm not going to go into them now, but if you read through the book, you'll see themes and extended metaphors in there that kind of all illustrate that idea. So for me, when I was writing the book and I was really trying to get that sense of connection to the book, every time I wrote the word Carpathia, it kind of just reminded me that this was a ship. What I wanted people to know was, well, yes, it's a ship, but it's also the main character of the book, and the name was one of the ways that I chose to do that. And also sort of in Greek, thea means divine, so there's all kinds of writerly intentions that go behind that decision, because if you recall, that's what I specialize in. I'm a writer. So that's the idea behind it. And some people love it, some people hate it. And from the conversations I've had with people, I really think who likes it and who dislikes it actually comes down to where they're coming into the story from, what their position was before they actually read the book, about whether or not they're receptive to that or not. So that's that question. So Mark Hopkins says, William Lyons was one of 4 passengers pulled out of the water by LB-14, commanded by 5th Officer Lowe after the Titanic sink. Yes, thank you, Mark. That is, and so that was the passenger who died aboard Carpathia.
Alicia wants to
Thank you.
clarify
Oh,
that
Mark says
question.
his surname was Hoyt. So William Lyons Hoyt. That is correct. Thank you. Sorry,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Alicia wanted to clarify that one question. So she asked about the illegal.
Yes.
So Alicia, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm not the best typist, so I wasn't sure if you understand. Basically, what I had heard is she was supposedly carrying illegal immigrants, got caught. Kennard couldn't pay her fines, so the Admiralty took her as collateral for the war effort in lieu of fining Kennard. I have not been able to find anything about whether or not that was accurate. So as you kind of just answered before, that's what I was kind of looking for.
So I've not heard that second part before. Yes, the immigrant issue did exist, and there were fines imposed, but the Admiralty, when the Admiralty took Carpathia, it was under those pre-existing agreements that actually existed because of the subsidies that they paid to Carpathia. Sorry, I beg your pardon, to Kennard. So the only time the Admiralty took her was during the war, and they already had the right to do so anyway. So that second part, I'm not sure where that's come from, but it's certainly not something that I have heard before. But yes, the first part, the issues with the immigrants, that certainly is true and does exist.
Thank you. The first part I had seen on a Facebook post and have never been able to really get any clarification on it. So I was hoping that, and what you said does make a lot of sense.
So I'm just trying to think where that source information is. I'm pretty sure the National Archives in London they have a whole heap of telegram correspondence, and from memory, so it's kind of like you have to read the telegrams and you only get one side of the telegram, so you get the replies to it. So that's where I know the information came from, to do with the fines and not having the right information. But I'm a little bit vague on the exact details of like how much the fine was and how many immigrants and the exact date and time, because that's not one of the sections that I actually include in the book. So I'm aware of it. I've read the information, but I didn't do a lot more research on that, because that time period, so that's actually not one of the time periods. There's a gap in where I actually covered, just because, I covered the period when she was built, the sea trials, and then sort of the Titanic and the First World War, because I've only got a certain amount of words that my publisher will give me, which is a shame. It would be nice to be able to write forever on this subject, but kind of what is of most interest to the readers, and that's kind of where I focus. But I am aware of that. If you want to know more, I can try and find those. I know I've definitely got copies of that information. I'll just have to find it. So if you're keen on it, please just maybe send me an email or let me know, and I'm happy to have a look.
I would love to be able to do that.
Yeah, sure. I'm more than happy to have a look and see what I can find, and it'll take me a couple of days to get to it. Let me.
Well, I question, jumping in here. If it was the illegal immigrants, did the fine go to the receiving? Was it the receiving country or the sending country that got
The sending country, because the issue was with the permissions that they had to carry. So immigrants were big business. Carrying them required permission from the country of origin. So they actually, and they basically they were selling the rights to shipping lines to be able to carry passengers from that country. I say selling the rights. I mean, it was all very bureaucratic. But the problem was either they didn't have the right permissions or they exceeded the number that they were allowed to carry. There was issues with the paperwork, and it was with the company. It was with the government. It was probably the Hungarian government, but don't quote me on that because that was when most of Carpathia's immigrants were actually coming from during that sort of period of intense immigration. I mean, there were other countries carried Italians as well, so sort of all those areas around the Mediterranean, but that was one of the main areas. So I think that's the country that fined her, but again, a little rusty on the details for this one. I'd have to dig out the sources and check it, which I am happy to do if Alicia sends me an email to remind me.
Okay, Jill, you have a question?
Yep. Hi, yeah, thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad you're able to join us today. And I was
My
really
pleasure.
happy to meet you through Adrian at the lighthouse. I just want to shout out to him because even though I've been studying the ship for so long, and he hasn't as very long either, like you, because he had the project, the idea of saving the lighthouse, and then did all this research like you. And then he was able to introduce me to people I'd never, hadn't heard of. So thank you for coming, and thank you for the book. And I really enjoyed the whole. And I like how you I forgot her youth, like Carpathia's youth. I like how you say that, and then take her through to, finding the wreck. And I like how you described a lot of the people, involved in Arthur Rostrom's, life. And I wondered if you thought, that life and death situation when he was young gave him courage, like, wow, I survived that, so maybe I didn't know what your thoughts were.
Yeah.
That gave
I,
him courage when he was
I think absolutely. I think so. So when Rostrom did his apprenticeship, that was still on sailing ships where the conditions were far more difficult than steamships. And he actually, in his memoirs, I think it was, he talks about like the life of a steamship captain is relatively easy compared to like his early apprenticeships. So he apprenticed on, I think it was the Conway on the Mersey. And then, he went and he was sailing around Cape Horn when there was an extraordinary storm. And, I mean, it's best to actually read his memoirs and see the experience. But yes, I definitely think those near brushes with death and the very rigorous early training in situations that were much more difficult than just operating a steamship as came later in life absolutely prepared him for the events of that night. But by the same token, don't forget that after those events, he went on to work his way up through the ranks. And you don't just become a captain of a steamship without having proven your mettle to Cunard over a period of years. So for any person in such a responsible position, they have to have the right kind of character. And that's why there's that whole hierarchy of working your way up through the ranks of an officer. You don't just walk into being a captain. You have to earn your way up, and he earned his way up. And by that time, he would have known what to do in those situations. But there's a lot with Rostrom's character. There is that early training on sailing ships. There is those experiences that he had with his own mortality. There is, I mean, he was an incredibly devout man, and his faith was an important part of who he was and the decisions that he made in life. So all of those things absolutely fed into it. And I actually think that it was fortunate that he was the one in command of Carpathia that night, but by the same token, he wasn't the only ship to respond. He was the one that reached there first. And because of that, he came under a spotlight and his life came under a spotlight. But I dare say there are many captains who would have been capable and performed ably in the same role. But, he had a particularly strong, noble character, which does come through and which we are aware of now because of everything that's ever been written on him. In fact, so Eric Clements wrote, it came out a couple of years ago, Captain of the Carpathia. I don't know if you've read it, that's a really good one to read if you're interested in Rostrum. It does include the Titanic rescue mission, but that's just a portion of the book. It's all about Rostrum. So if you've read his memoirs, you get that perspective from him, and then you get that kind of historical perspective of his whole life in Captain of the Carpathia. So that's a good read.
Oh, we'll have to add that to our reading list next year when we're doing Carpathia. Thank you so much. That's yeah, I just love how we really got to know
I'm
him.
just going to adjust my blinds. Just a moment.
Yeah, it's signing in. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, bright.
It's waking up and it's waking up in Australia.
Yes, the sun has risen right into my eyes.
Oh dear. Alrighty. Well, what happened during the voyage that returned the survivors to New York?
That story is so interesting.
That story.
So we hear a lot about those few hours in the dead of night that Carpathia raced to the rescue, but then in most sources that you read, it's almost like a time skip occurred. She picked up the survivors, and the next thing you know, she's arrived in New York, and there were days between those things where I mean, there's way too much to just talk about in just a few minutes. But so when Captain Rostrum picked up the survivors, there were things like forming a committee of those survivors to actually help those left destitute. So you probably know Molly Brown famously was part of that committee. The committee raised the subscription for the Loving Cup and the medals that were awarded to Carpathia crew members. So that was something that was happening with the passengers of Titanic. Ismay is in Dr. McGee's cabin, and Captain Rostrum is trying to coordinate, coordinate the survivors with this committee and consult with Ismay at certain times about what's the best procedure that they want to follow, because there are now Titanic survivors aboard and White Star has to be consulted. The other things that are going on are weather. So they had storms and fog and poor weather through that voyage back. In fact, one night a storm actually, like thunder, actually woke some of the passengers up, and there was panic because first thing they thought was the Carpathia has hit an iceberg. Other things that were going on were, if you look at New York just for a second, and the communication systems of the time, so we're using wireless telegrams that, unless your ship had a strong enough receiver that it could go from ship to shore, they were usually relayed from ship to ship to ship to shore. And Carpathia's set was it was outdated and it had a short range, so she was often out of communication. And the New York papers were basically reporting anything and everything that they thought would sell papers. So much speculation at the time, but they didn't know what was happening. And by the time news had arrived on shore that Titanic had sunk and that the survivors were aboard Carpathia, the world was desperate for news, but Captain Rostrum on board Carpathia had kind of embargoed the press. He was most concerned with the security and the comfort of the survivors. And it wasn't that he didn't think that the world needed to know, it was that he didn't want, because there were pressmen aboard Carpathia, very famously, Con Campbell as well as Carlos Hurd were actually aboard Carpathia. And there's like, if you read some of the sources that Carlos and Catherine, his wife, wrote about their struggles to actually interview survivors and then write a story and get that story transmitted back to, so he worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, but there was a sister paper in New York. I think it was The World. I can't quite remember which the paper was, and they were desperately trying to write this story and get it back, but the captain wouldn't let them use the wireless machine. Sorry, wouldn't let them send a wireless machine, and Carlos even tried to bribe Harold Cottam, the wireless operator, and Captain Rostrum had given specific orders that press messages weren't to be sent. But it wasn't that he was trying to keep the world from knowing the truth. It was because of this system of wireless communication being ship to shore and the very poor weather that they had at the time that impeded their signals. It was actually really difficult for them to send messages. And the messages that were given priority were official messages between the ship and Cunard and the ship and White Star. They were messages that were relaying the survivors' names. That was a big one. And so there were hundreds of names. And if you think that they had to tap each of those names out, and then they were contending with poor weather, it actually took them days just to send those messages. And by this time, the wireless operator, Harold Cottam, he hasn't slept for 2 days. They had to bring Harry Bride with his frostbitten feet in to help. So Harry, I say Harry, it was Harold, but in the book I call him Harry because I have scenes with two Harolds and it was difficult to write. So we've got the two wireless operators in there. We've got other passengers as well. So I mean, if we go back to Carlos and Catherine, we've got Catherine is trying to interview the women survivors. She's not a newspaper man, but she was trying to help her husband. And you hear some of her accounts of actually the survivors, the stories that those women told her, because the women, the upper class women, were actually all grouped together in Carpathia's library. So some of them obviously had cabins, but there were not enough cabins to go around. So and one thing I find incredibly interesting in this whole saga between the idea of the press trying to get messages out and Captain Rostrum trying to protect the rights and the privacy and the grief of the survivors, as well as, use the wireless in trying conditions, trying to get those official messages out. The Hurds in things that they wrote later, but they actually thought that the captain was conspiring against them. Now, Rostrum, in some of his sources, he makes reference to Carlos Hurd. He doesn't use his name, but it's clear when you've done lots of readings that he talks about a newspaper man trying to write the story, and it's Carlos Hurd. But then the Hurds talk about in some of their historical resources the fact that they believe Captain Rostrum had the stewards searching their rooms looking for the story. So whether or not you actually believe that, I don't come down one way or the other. I tend to think that it's probably not something Captain Rostrum would do, but it might be something that they felt like had happened. And these ideas that they said that the stationery was all removed. So one day when Catherine went into the library to talk to the women and to get their stories, essentially, one day there was a lot of stationery, and the next day they went back because they couldn't buy any stationery from the ship's store to write the actual report down that Carlos wanted to wire back to buy back to the world for them to actually print. The next day they go to the library and all the paper has been removed, and one of the survivors there will say, well, it wasn't used, the paper was actually removed. So you kind of have to decide which sources you believe, and that's always something difficult because there's always more than one side to a story. But I found that whole saga interesting because even I won't say it here, because if you do intend to read the book, I don't want to kind of spoil everything, but what Carlos actually does with his story and how he gets this story to shore is incredibly interesting. And then there's the debacle with the telegrams. So President of the United States is actually concerned about Major Archibald Butt, and who was his friend, and actually sent wireless messages to Carpathia that got lost within all of the other wireless communications that were coming through. And then there was this furor about whether or not Carpathia was ignoring communications from the President of the United States. And in fact, because of this issue with the wireless, in the end, the whole eastern seaboard of the United States were actually ordered into kind of turn off their wireless. There were only 3 shore stations that were still allowed to communicate because everybody was desperately trying to get news from Carpathia, which was limited by all those conditions and trying to send those survivors' names. And so those are just some of kind of the most interesting things, and that's not even going into the stories of the individual survivors themselves on board Carpathia and the passengers, and the way that the passengers of Carpathia responded, which is incredibly moving. In fact, I saw on your website you actually have, and forgive me for pronunciation, George Behe or Behe actually is coming to visit. Thank you. So his book, Voices of Carpathia, which contains all of the letters from the crew members, survivors. So, you've got the letters that were written by Titanic survivors, but this one, because it focuses on the Carpathia, that was an incredibly valuable source. I don't know how many years he must have spent collecting those letters, but I remember I know you can buy the book on Amazon now, but before you could actually buy it on Amazon, it was available on a site called lulu.com, and I came across it. It was just like a PDF, and I printed it out, and I was reading through all of these letters, and I actually ended up cross-referencing everything. So like I had a document when I would write the word ice, and every time I came across a letter from someone aboard Carpathia, a letter or a report or something that had the word ice, I'd scribble my page numbers down so that whenever I wanted to write about ice, I could go back and actually see what were the first-hand accounts at the time. So that one was incredibly important resource. And in the end, I could only put a few characters in because, again, I'm limited by words. So I had to kind of choose those characters, or I say characters, but these real people whose stories would most resonate with readers. But yeah, so there's the things that's happening with the passengers, the things that's happening with the survivors committee, the things that are happening in the wireless cabin, and then everything that's happening on shore as the world is desperate for news. And in fact, they end up thinking that there's a conspiracy between Cunard and White Star to cover up the events, because in this situation, people, by this time, they know Titanic has sunk. They know survivors are on Carpathia. They're desperate for news, but Carpathia is not sending details of the disaster. And they're thinking, well, and they're going, well, why is this happening? And instantly people's minds go, well, it must be a conspiracy between Cunard and White Star because Ismay's aboard Carpathia. So that voyage, which gets so often glossed over in books, that just kind of go, well, there's the secondary sources. Here's the rescue, and the next thing we've got the arrival in New York. Then those days, I don't know, they're just missing. And then when we get to that final day, the Thursday that she actually arrived, because there was so many questions about what had actually happened and what was perceived as silence from Carpathia about this issue. When Carpathia actually arrived, in New York, she was actually met by virtually an armada of press boats, and news reporters who were trying to actually board the ship during the various, sort of immigration and customs stop. They were trying to get on board, and there were reporters on the pilot boat, and the captain had to dispatch officers to actually keep people from boarding the ship because they were desperate, desperate for news. So that what actually happened is, in my opinion, some of the most interesting information about the week. So she left New York on a Thursday, and by the time she got back, it was 1 week later on a Thursday. Some of the most interesting days are actually that passage back.
I'm gonna just throw this out there for everybody. Most everybody already knows I'm an extra class amateur radio operator, and the wireless is and all that is near and dear to my heart. And you were talking about relaying the messages from one ship to another. The whole Titanic thing and that whole problem with communications and the fact that everybody was trying to jam the airwaves, people don't realize that there was really only one channel back then on the wireless. And if you listen to news radio or something and hear lightning, that's what it is. I mean, it splattered everything. So they tried to limit it, but yeah. That whole thing is how all the radio regulations and everything came into play. And the Organization for Amateur Radio happened to be named the American Radio Relay League, just because back then we still relayed messages from place to place. And that is still a big component of what we're doing with disasters, is being able to take a message that somebody generates and yeah. Anyway, I digress.
No, it's interesting. I had no idea until I started to look into it what the issues are, because you just don't, if you don't know, you don't know. And that idea of when you send a message, everyone can hear it because everybody's on that same channel. And if you have a ship with a stronger broadcasting set, then your message gets drowned out. And it takes that idea. It's kind of like that idea of, when you're a kid and you sit in a circle and everyone whispers like a sentence in one person's ear, and then it goes all around the circle, and by the time it gets back to you, it might be different. And that's exactly what it was like. It was like relaying. So some of the newer ships like Olympic and Titanic had sets that were capable of those very long distances, but other ships like Carpathia, it was very much a relay, and it was dependent on what are the ships are in the area, what are their broadcasting ranges, what are the atmospheric conditions like. So it's kind of this idea that they're just going to send a list of survivors' names. No, it took them days to do that.
Yeah, I had to go from the name had to go out to one ship, and then it had to be verified, and it had to be passed on. Yeah, it's not as easy as a lot of people think, and it's really funny because back then it was all Morse code. Was seriously all it was text messaging, and the brass ring, so to speak, was to be able to get voice. And now we have voice and all this wonderful technology. And what are we doing? We're going back to text messages. So I think civilization is doomed.
Well, we're going back to, what do we like, emoticons and things? We're going back to pictograms, really.
I never thought of it that way, but that's very good. Okay, I'm gonna move on here. Let me know if you're getting tired. You need to go.
I'm fine to hang around for a bit more. Sure.
Cool. What happened to Carpathia after the events of 1912?
So after the events of 1912, she essentially settled back into the same service that she had beforehand, transporting immigrants from Europe over to the United States, but also holiday cruising. So she was one of the first ships that actually that carried sort of middle class American citizens over to the continent to do the whole sort of Mediterranean holiday idea. So, just considering the time period, ships were a mechanism for transport. It's only in modern times that they've really become holiday. That when people don't use ships for transport, typically, unlike a cargo, sure, but they don't. It's not their first choice. They're going to fly a 12-hour flight versus a voyage of days or weeks, depending on where you're going. But during this period, this idea of holiday cruising was actually emerging. So ships were becoming more than get from one location to another. They were a means to actually go and explore the world. So, and in fact, that's what a lot of the passengers on Carpathia during the rescue mission were actually doing. They were en route to the Mediterranean to sort of do that Mediterranean holiday. So that's essentially what she was doing. She was carrying immigrants and holidays and cargo, and that's what a ship does. And I guess there are a couple of interesting sort of points in her history, but I mean, in my research, I didn't kind of go into them a great deal just because during this period of, between 1912 and 1918, it's kind of like essentially the same thing is happening with like a few things of note, like the occasional, you know, passenger who might attempt suicide or contraband being found on board. So there are a few things. In fact, if you want to read a really detailed history that covers everything, I cannot recommend highly enough Roger Pickenpaw's biography of Carpathia. When I was doing my research, this book was like a Bible to me because Mr. Pickenpaw has gone, and he's a historian, he has gone through all the records, and it's very much this is everything that the records tell us about Carpathia. On this date, on this time, this happened. So that book is meticulously researched, but it has the minutia of the day in and the day out of basically every source that he could find has actually gone into it. So that's a great book to read if you really want to know all of those details. But the next most interesting thing to actually happen was, being requisitioned and used in the Admiralty. And just like many ships, there are a few stories about her use in the First World War. So there was she was found carrying rubber, which was contraband at the time. Basically because they didn't want rubber to go across to the continent because military transports needed rubber for tires and things like that. So if you don't send rubber across, they can't make these things. So transports are kind of hampered. So there are those kinds of elements, but essentially it was her war service and then her actual the end of her story, which was in 1918 in July, when she was sunk while part of a convoy carrying troops, not carrying some troops, and not many, but a few troops back to the United States from Liverpool. She'd been docked at the Huskisson dock. I don't know. I'm happy to sort of tell you the end of her story if you want to know. But if anybody wants to read the book, it might spoil the end of the book as well.
We're trying to encourage people to get the book. I got mine online. I read about halfway through it.
I don't want to spoil it for you then, because
because that's all I could get with the time I had, and I was reading incessantly over the last few days. So
I won't spoil it then.
Okay, let's get into the dive. How did you get in touch with the dive expedition leader, Rick Waring? And how dangerous was the whole dive expedition and the whole discovery process. Yeah,
So this is so every part of her history I really do find fascinating, including her modern history. So I'll just tell you, if for anyone who's not aware, Carpathia's wreck was actually discovered during an expedition that was funded by Clive Cussler and Numa. So they discovered the wreck in 2000, and I mean, they'd had a general idea where the wreck actually was, but there were some conflicting coordinates. There were coordinates given from the captain of Carpathia at the time, which was William Prothero, and also the submarine that sank the ship and the submarine. So there was, so there was some, some charts and things. So there was some conflicting reports of where she actually was. And by the time they actually discovered the wreck in the year 2000, that whole journey is actually really fascinating. And in fact, if anyone is interested in that, there's a documentary on it. It's part of a series called Sea Hunters, and they actually they filmed the actual search for Carpathia's wreck. And it's not a long documentary. It's like a series of searches for shipwrecks, and it's well worth a watch. I think it's only about 45 minutes, but it's really quite fascinating. But then what happened after that wreck, so where they actually discovered her, she's over 500 feet down, a couple of 100 miles off the southwest coast of Ireland. And at those particular depths, it is beyond the reach of regular recreational divers. It requires what's called technical diving, which is a specialized type of diving where highly trained individuals who are very experienced use special equipment in order to reach those depths. They use what's called, so normally you would have a scuba tank where you just have a oxygen that or a mix that you're breathing, because they're down for hours and hours. They have what's called rebreathers, so equipment that will actually scrub CO2 and recycle your gas mix, and special types of gas mixes, because at those depths you've got to deal with things like nitrogen narcosis, which is where if your gas mix has too much nitrogen in it, you'll get the effects of almost it's like being drunk essentially underwater, and things like decompression. So there's all these issues to do. And so decompression, so for example, when you dive to those depths, this is just an example, it's going to be different for different divers depending on their gear and their setup and their gas mixes. But say you spend 15 minutes at 500 feet, you might have anywhere between 4 to 6 hours of decompression just for those 18 minutes of bottom time. So actually it's a very technical sport, and it is quite dangerous because of that. And in my research on Carpathia, I'd read reports of a team that had actually dived Carpathia's wreck. So there were 2 dives to the wreck, one soon after she was discovered in 2001, and also another later larger dive in 2007, mostly because the 2001 dive, in sort of the dive community, there was some contention about whether or not the men who had dived the wreck had actually dived Carpathia. So they ended up forming a larger expedition in 2007 that included technical divers from England, Italy, and Germany, I believe it was. And so they chartered a boat, and then they went out and they dived to these extraordinary depths. And it is something that is quite dangerous. I can tell you that one of the men on that expedition has since died in a diving related incident. So technical diving does carry risks, but if you were to ask a technical diver about those risks, they will tell you that, if you are prepared, and they are, I mean, they don't do this casually or lightly. They are wholly prepared to to dive to those depths with the right equipment, the right calculations about gas mix. So it's called technical diving for a reason, but it is dangerous, and it does. And when unexpected things happen, there are casualties. So it is something that's dangerous. And I mean, I didn't understand any of this. It was Rick Waring that explained all of this to me. So Rick is the dive leader of the 2007 expedition, and Rick is a firefighter in Manchester. And I'd read some reports in dive magazines about this expedition. So, kind of like a 2 or 3 page spread of the 2007 dive expedition. And as the expedition leader, I wanted to know more about it, because I felt like this was such an interesting part of Carpathia's history that anyone who was interested in this ship would want to know about this as well. And because Rick is a firefighter, what I ended up doing to contact him, because I was literally searching for Rick Waring, who at the time I didn't know, but his Rick is actually for Richard, but I was looking for a Richard Waring, who was a technical diver who lived in Manchester, but I didn't have the first idea how to start. And one of the dive articles had mentioned that he was a firefighter, and it had talked about where he actually was. So I kind of worked out, okay, this is who the council would be, and this is the fire service. So I ended up sending just a general customer request email to the local council saying, I don't actually have a council related question. I'm trying to track someone down. And then I sort of gave the spiel, and I said, this person is a Manchester firefighter. Rick Waring is his name. He dived the Carpathia. And I sort of said in that email, I said, I know you, for privacy reasons, you won't be able to give me his details, but could you please kindly forward this email on to him, or let him know, that this Australian researcher is trying to get in touch with him. And I wasn't sure whether it had actually worked or not, because it took a couple of weeks, but I did. I ended up getting a reply from Rick. And from there, Rick became my primary source of information for those dive expeditions, because he was one of only 2 people who was on both dives. So he was the leader of the larger 2007 dive, as well as he was also a member of the 2000 dive. And interestingly, sort of as like a side note with the dive expeditions, you may have heard of RMS Titanic Inc., who for a long time was salver
Mhm.
and possessor of the Titanic artifacts. They had actually engaged a French expedition from a company called Comex, and they were actually on site doing a survey of Carpathia's wreck at the same time that this group of English, Italian, and German divers actually arrived, wanting to do a technical dive of the actual ship. So we have these 2 ships, one which is there at the behest of the owners of Carpathia's wreck, because at that time, RMS Titanic Inc. had actually, it's a long, complicated story. RMS Titanic Inc. had purchased the rights to Carpathia. They then sold them to someone else and then leased the rights back. But they were there doing sort of a salvage and survey expedition. And the dive team had actually been in communication with RMS Titanic Inc. about diving Carpathia. So, and there was a bit of back and forth. So there was sort of some tension about whether or not RMS Titanic Inc. had, because they initially we thought that the guys actually thought that Titanic Inc. was going to sponsor their dive, because it's an expensive endeavor. Just sort of chartering the boat cost £30,000. Because usually when these guys dive, it's a 1-day operation. They'll dive from shore, so they'll take a boat out to the wreck and then they'll dive, and then they'll end up on shore. But because of where Carpathia was, they actually had to charter a boat in order to do this. So then we have these 2 boats on site at the same time in this wreck that, has been visited twice over the last 100 years. Once when they actually found and identified her, and once in the 2001 dive, and now again in 2007. But this time we've got 2 boats on site with competing interests, because you know, some wreck divers will actually want to take artifacts from a wreck, and without getting into any discussion about the ethical considerations and where people actually come down on this issue, because there are both sides to the issue. There was sort of some contention about the bell, because so Carpathia's bell, because what actually happened was when Numa discovered Carpathia's wreck, and you'll actually see this if you were to watch that documentary on Sea Hunters, when they discovered the wreck, they took rover footage. So they had a ROV underwater that was taking footage, and in that footage is something that is distinctly bell-shaped, and that a lot of people actually speculated on that might actually be Carpathia's bell. So if you know anything about wreck diving, there's a certain cachet if you're a wreck diver and you can recover a ship's bell. Any wreck that is recovered has to be declared in the UK to the receiver of wreck, because the Crown has certain interests, but often they will decide to allow the salver to retain possession of those of what it is that they've salvaged. So we have these two vessels on site, and they're both looking for the bell, a bell that had potentially been seen in rover footage years earlier. And I won't tell you how that story ends, but I mean, it's fascinating as well. But yes, it was dangerous, and in fact, the dive was actually made also dangerous, the 2007 dive, by the fact that Janus was on site. So Janus is the name of the survey vessel that Comex, the company that had been commissioned by Titanic to actually carry out the survey and salvage, were actually operating. And so rovers have an umbilical cord that goes from the ship down to the rover, but also the propellers on that ship were quite distinct in that they were designed to allow the ship to stay perfectly stationary in a position, and the team were actually quite worried that about diving and then potentially coming up in the vicinity of this ship with these like kind of special types of propellers. So we have the salvage crew on board, and then we have the divers who are already doing something that even though they will prepare, and even though there are divers who dive their whole life without incident, there are also divers that die doing this, and then they're in this situation, which is made more complicated by the fact there's also another vessel on site with surveying the ship. So what was essentially something that carries inherent risk did become more dangerous. But yeah, that's also quite a fascinating story.
And I
So
think
didn't they use submersibles? So there's a few comments in here. So Kurt Nowak says Sea Hunters is available on Amazon Prime. Carpathia episode is in season 1. Mark Hopkins asks, didn't they use submersibles? So the divers did not use submersibles. They have to use submersibles to go to Titanic because of the depths that Titanic is. That's like you can't do technical diving at those depths. But no. So what happens with the technical diving is they wear what's called dry suits. So suits that are designed to insulate them and actually keep them dry at those depths. And then they will actually descend. It's called a shot line. So it's tied in from one end to the boat and then the other end into the wreck, and they'll descend along the shot line. And the descent does not take very long, because you can just go from top to bottom. But once you're at the bottom, you have a certain amount of time based on it's called a deco schedule, so a decompression schedule, and that is how long you're at the bottom versus the mix of gases that you're actually breathing in your rebreather versus how long you actually have to decompress at certain depths. And that's what the shot line is. So the shot line will actually, they'll go up the shot line and they'll kind of clip themselves on so they don't drift in the current. And then on those shot lines, there are usually secured emergency air tanks and things like that as well. But no, they did not require submersibles at that depth. But having said that, we're not talking about a huge number of people who can actually do what these men did. They're technical divers for a reason. There's like a handful of them in the world, and they didn't require submersibles just because they are technical divers. A regular diver cannot do this. They all started out as regular divers, but their passion led them into this very specialized field within diving.
Yeah, and you touched on in your book, I believe, the fact that the ships have more than one bell. Because you have the bell at the base of the mast, the bell in the crow's nest, and the bell on the bridge for ringing time. If you've heard the bell here, I've got ship's bells going off every once in a while to let me know. Well, I spent a lot of time in the ocean, so yeah, you take the sea away from the sailor, but you can't take the sailor away from the sea or whatever. But yes, that's there. Okay, I'm going to wrap these two questions together. What was the most interesting thing you uncovered during your research? And what new information about Carpathia was brought to light in the book?
Oh, I get to talk about some of my favorite things. So I'll tell you one of my favorite, like when we're talking about research, one of my favorite things. I don't know whether you'll find this as fascinating as I do, because this is where my love of history comes in. So just general history, not just maritime history. When I was doing research for this book in the early stages, I was reading everything I could about Carpathia. So a lot of secondary sources. And these sources would all refer to the fact that they'd have this kind of sentence like, when Carpathia was finishing, the shipyard was actually widened and they uncovered stones from Wall's End during this period. Now, if you're not familiar with Wall's End, there's a historic Roman wall that runs across the breadth of England. It's called Hadrian's Wall. It's also called oh my gosh, I've forgotten the other name for it. If someone knows, put it in the comment box. The Roman Wall, that's what it is. And it's a very famous wall. There's parts of it that you can still walk along right now. And I was really fascinated by the idea that at the time Carpathia was being built, so she's brand new, what's essentially a 2,000-year-old artifact was being uncovered. And I found a real resonance between this idea of something that was new, connected to something that was thousands of years old at the time. But now Carpathia to us, she's more than a century old, so she is a historical artifact. So there was this connection between the past and the present that I found really resonant. And I wanted to know a little bit more about the unearthing of these stones from Wall's End. So when I was over in Newcastle, I actually went to the Tyne and Wear archives, and I happened to be chatting to one of the archivists. And she happened to be an archaeologist by trade. And I said, well, where can I find out more about the excavation of the Wall's End stones in the Swan and Hunter shipyard when Carpathia was actually being built? And she didn't know, but she sort of sent an email off to the local council archaeologist. And then I got an email back telling me exactly where I needed to go to find the source information that I wanted, and a note that said, by the way, did you know there's a blog by a respected Roman historian that actually says that stones from Wall's End were placed aboard Carpathia in a glass display case. So there's me with all of my sort of writerly intentions thinking, oh, there's some beautiful themes between past and present here that I'd really like to sort of weave into some of the book. Actually then having someone tell me, well, it's not just you weaving this connection out of thin air. They actually took stones from this relic and they put them on display in Carpathia. And I hadn't heard this anywhere before. So I went and I looked on this blog, and I read the information, and there was a list of historical sources actually there. And so I dashed off an email to the author of the blog and I said, can you tell me where this information is? But I was impatient. So I was already due to go to the Great North Museum, and they had a library there. And some of the sources that had been listed on that blog information, I thought, well, maybe this information's come from one of these sources. So I went there, I went through all of the sources, and I couldn't find anything. But this library and museum is actually connected to one of the universities there. And so I was on their computer, on their catalog, looking up books, and I saw that there happened to be a number of books on the Roman wall over in one of the university libraries, which was actually, that campus was actually just across the street from the museum. So I thought, okay, I'll dash across the street and I'll have a look, and I'll see if I can find anything in any of these books. And I just assumed I could walk into the library like I can walk into a library here in Australia. But I walked into the university's library, and there was security guards at the front, and there was a big gate. And I saw all these students swiping cards to get in. And I thought, oh, the books I want are upstairs. I'm so close. And eventually I kind of sweet talked my way past the security guard. I say sweet talked, but I think I was just like this Australian person garbling stuff at him about ships and stones and wanting to look at books, and he just kind of went, go look. So I got myself access to the library. I went to the shelves, and then I started just pulling off book after book on the Roman wall, just thinking, where can I find this reference to stones from Wall's End being on Carpathia? And it was just one of those things. I was there were two shelves. I was at the end, and it was winter in England, so I had coats and scarves, and I'd ended up taking off all my coats and scarves, and I'd made myself a little nest at the end of the aisle. Fortunately, the books were on the bottom two shelves, and I was sitting down, and I just happened to pick up this book, and it was a red bound book with gold lettering on the side, and it was written by an author called Jesse Mothersbaugh. And the book just kind of fell open on my lap. And by this time, I had spent so much time reading reference material that my eyes were just trained to spot the word Carpathia. And the book just kind of fell open on my lap, and I saw it. I saw Carpathia. And there was absolutely no reason for the name of that ship to appear in a book on Hadrian's Wall unless it was the reference that I was looking for. And in fact, it was. I've actually got that one here. I'll show you as well, because it was just one of those beautiful serendipitous things that actually occurred during my research. I'd had this idea. I'd found this idea, and I found this actual tangible link, and then I found the book just by following these leads. So you can see it here. So while part of Messrs. Swan and Hunter's shipyard was being leveled prior to the building of the Mauretania, this part of the wall was discovered not far from the river bank. The Carpathia was completing at the time at the same yard, and several wall stones were placed in the saloon in a glass case. And so that's not the end of the story. Sorry, I feel like I'm being a bit long-winded with this story. But a couple of days later, I was actually back at the Tyne and Weir archives, and I was going through some images that I had actually already seen before. And yet suddenly, with this new information that Carpathia had stones placed aboard in a glass case, I kind of looked at an old image with new eyes. So this is an image from Carpathia's library. You've probably seen it before, because you can actually see this one online in various places. But if you look here, you'll actually see there's a glass case here with what looks suspiciously like a stone. And I ended up sending this image to that Roman historian, and I said, what do you think? And he was like, yeah, it's the right shape and size. So it is very likely that we're looking at a photograph of stones from Wall's End that were uncovered during her construction, that were actually placed aboard the ship. And interestingly, that are probably still there on her wreck. So that's probably one of my favorite things. And I love it, not just because of that connection to history. And even though it's not just Carpathia, it's also Wolves End, but also for me, it was really this trail, this idea of following something. And so one more thing that I'll share, which will probably be of particular interest to you, because this is far more Titanic related, is that I happened to come across a letter. I was in, where was I? I was in Liverpool at the Sydney Jones Library at the University of Liverpool, and they have a special collection because they hold the Cunard archives. And I was really interested in Carpathia's name and because obviously I was calling her Thea, and I was interested in knowing what was the origin of this name. Why did they actually call Carpathia Carpathia? And so I found in just I think I've got hold on, I'm just looking at slides that I have. I think I actually have a slide of this too. Oh, I did. Okay, so let me share this with you. So I happened to find, while I was going through the very many records that they have, documents that related to the naming of ships. So you can see here, there's kind of a list of some of their names and the meanings between them, because during that period, sort of Carpathia was very much naming their ships over locations, sort of Europe, North Africa, those kinds of things. And I happen to see, if you look, you'll see Carpathia, sort of a third of the way down, which was, the reference is Austria-Hungary. But I was flipping through this file of names and I found something I had not expected. So most of the file was just this kind of loose leaf paper with this typed sheets. But in the file, I found this handwritten letter, and I've actually got images of it here, and I had to get permission from the archives, because I actually reproduced this is the only single source that I actually reproduce word for word in the book. I actually just typed out the letter, because I have a scene here where this character is actually writing this letter, because this letter actually was written by a gentleman by the name of Charles H. Marshall, and it contains extracts from the Encyclopedia Americana and the Encyclopedia Britannica that talk about the meanings of certain locations. For example, Lusitania, Mauritania, and Carpathia. Now, I know that you know that these are two incredibly famous ships, and then we have Carpathia on the same page. And this is well before Carpathia became famous. So this is kind of circa 1900. There's no exact year on it, but it's February 23. So it's circa 1900. But what was particularly interesting to me was the name of the person who wrote this letter, Charles H. Marshall. And for some reason, it just stayed with me. I didn't know why it was so familiar to me, but it was. And it wasn't until later that I was rereading some old sources that I realized that there was a passenger aboard Carpathia by the name of Charles H. Marshall, who had nieces aboard Titanic. And this is kind of what he's famously known for. He was aboard Carpathia, and the morning that they rescued the survivors, there was a knock on the door, and it was a steward telling him that his nieces wished to see him. And he replied, and he said, "But my nieces are on Titanic." And obviously they were on Carpathia by that time, because they had been picked up from the lifeboats. But the names were the same. And I started to go, hold on a second. Charles H. Marshall wrote this letter about the name of Carpathia and sent it to Cunard. And, approximately 12 years later, a Charles H. Marshall is on Carpathia at the time of the disaster, and his nieces are aboard Titanic. And through research, and I was so lucky that he actually wrote this on stationery from his company. You'll actually see there's a little emblem here. So it's the Liverpool and London and Globe Company. I was able to go through historical records and actually find information on the Charles H. Marshall that worked at this company, and was able to verify that the same person that wrote this letter circa 1900 was the same person aboard Carpathia the night that she rescued the Titanic survivors, which was the same person, as we all know, whose nieces had been aboard been aboard Titanic. So that was sort of something new that I uncovered. And there were other things. So there was, on Carpathia's maiden voyage, there was a baby who the passengers had called Carpathius after the ship, and no one ever knew the name of the baby. All the newspaper reports on the maiden voyage had said this baby's called Carpathius. So I went and found that kind of baby's name. Other things that I found, so the actual story of Carpathia's sinking, which I won't tell you here, but which is really fascinating, the details of that. So we know Carpathia sank, but there were reasons for it, very specific reasons to do with the convoy that she was in. So I actually found some records from military archives over in the US that actually have telegrams from actually have reports from other captains in the convoy that actually talk about the things that the others, the potential implications of why Carpathia was the ship that was actually hit by the tornado and sunk. And I got I contacted someone who I actually got a hold of the log of U-55, the ship that sunk Carpathia. So I was able to kind of compare those logs as well and piece that together. So I don't know anywhere else that has as detailed account of the final moments of Carpathia, certainly, like the details of what actually happened when she sank. So, sorry, I tend to
No,
talk for.
that's quite okay. Did they do a did they ever do a inquiry or an inquest on the sorry, my dog's in the background panting. You can hear that back there. Did they ever do an inquest on the sinking of the Carpathia, and did you get any information from that?
There were reports written. So I've read the reports on the sinking. So there were Admiralty reports. There wasn't an inquest. There was a what actually happened, as would be the case with any ship that sank during that time. But by the same token, there were a lot of ships sinking during that time. So this wasn't a period where, they would spend considerable time just doing an inquest on one single ship. It's a what happened. When we understand the reasons for it, it's just kind of one more war casualty in a number of war casualties, because they were happening at an alarming rate at that period, because the Germans were basically targeting anything by that stage, not just maritime, not just, I beg your pardon, military ships. They basically, it was open warfare. So there were certainly reports, and they did investigate the events. And in fact, it was that investigation that I got a hold of those reports from, and that allowed me to understand what had actually happened when she sank. But there was no inquiry. There was no like accountability. There was no blame placing, if you will. It was just what actually led to those events.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the end here. You have done a wonderful job at doing the research, and oh my gosh, so thorough.
Thank you. I enjoy research. Like I said, I started out with very little experience in this area, and I didn't want to shortchange readers. I didn't want to do, a mediocre job. The research was incredibly important when you're writing a book like this. And in fact, I remember the first draft of the book I gave to my supervisor. He said, "Yes, it's great." Well, no, he didn't say, "Yes, it's great." He said, "It's boring." He said, "It's boring because I put so much of the research into it that I was forgetting the story." And in the end, that's what my book is. It's the story of those events. It's absolutely non-fiction, but as a writer, it's important for me to tell that non-fiction story using techniques that emphasize the story for you, that make you feel a connection to the ship, the characters, the setting, the conflicts that were actually happening at that time, rather than just giving you, well, on this date this happened, which would have been easier to do, but probably wouldn't have been as interesting to read.
All righty then. Jill says, thank you so much for for incredible interview. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Um,
Thank you again for inviting me.
Oh yeah, this has been a joy. What a way to spend a Saturday afternoon.
Sunday morning.
Yes, and thank you, and we're so glad to get it scheduled when we did. I just even though there was the time delay of between emails, it was really a blessing. So anybody else have any quick comments before we wrap this up? See if anybody's posting anything in the chat.
I've just put my email address in the chat box. I realized I thought I'd put it in earlier, but I feel like I might have actually sent that as a direct message to Jill instead of everyone. So Alicia, if you didn't get my email earlier, please do send me an email and I'll look up those sources for you. But I'm always happy to answer questions if anyone has them, because I do have actually a lot of sources on my hard drive. Which I'm more than happy to consult and to talk about Carpathia.
That was awesome. Thank you for your generosity of your time.
My pleasure.
Yes, it was absolutely wonderful. So anyway, thank you. I encourage everybody to get the book. What I've read so far has been absolutely wonderful. And especially the history of the ship and what happened that night. Now, where is the book available? Where can you get it?
So you are in the US. I would suggest that Amazon is possibly the best place, or Book Depository. The reason being, so my publisher is Australian. You can just go into a bookstore here and buy it, but the rights haven't actually been licensed over in the US. So you can buy it on Amazon, but I believe that Book Depository, because they've shipped copies over to the UK. So either of those two locations that you can get it.
Yeah, I got mine on Google Play of all places. Google Books.
So you bought the ebook?
I bought the ebook.
Yes. Yeah.
I have too many.
I'm the same. So I actually tend to buy nonfiction in hard copy because I'm often using nonfiction as reference material, and it's quite useful to be able to flick through that. But with fiction, I buy all my fiction as digital, and I have to really love the book, and then I'll go and buy the hard copy, because otherwise I've got no space on my shelves.
Yeah, the only problem with the ebooks is when talking to somebody like you, I can't ask for a sticker and put it in the cover. So, but yeah, I mean, you just tend to get so many books and then you run out of room, and there you go. So, all righty. Well, thank you so much. And we really appreciate it. And feel free to come into the group on Facebook and comment and all that. And Alicia said, please tell her how much loved her book. One of the best she's ever read. So
thank you, Alicia. I really appreciate that.
All righty. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Thank you so much, Jay. You're awesome. And I
My
love
pleasure.
your insight and your knowledge. And, a lot of times when we're reading about Titanic, we hear the same facts over and over. And I think Titanic enthusiasts are thirsty for something new. And I feel like you brought out something new that, to talk about in details that
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, when I wrote the book, that was really forefront in my mind, that a lot of Carpathia was missing from that story. So if you read the book, you'll actually see there are no scenes set on Titanic. And that's actually absolutely deliberate on my part. So you get this side of the story because that side of the story is already so well documented. And I mean, I just wanted to emphasize the role that this ship, which has largely been forgotten by the community outside
Right.
those who are interested, what that story actually is.
Because when I first listened, I bought the book and then I bought the ebook of George's, the Book of Letters, and I was like, reading about, people giving up their honeymoon suite. The ship had to make
Yes.
room for 712 people that they weren't planning on, and how they were willing to give up their clothes and their
Yes, they
space.
did all of those things. They were, they were the soul of kindness and compassion, the passengers aboard Carpathia. And in the face of all that grief, I mean, it's hard. It's hard when someone's grieving to offer comfort in those scenarios. And then they had hundreds of people just grieving that they had to take care of, and they essentially became caregivers to the survivors of the disaster.
I know, and they weren't expecting that. When you talk about trying to adjust to what is in your life, like those people adjusted to what was and, went with it. And then you see those like heroines like Margaret Brown doing fundraising. I guess she was very public about who donated what. So she
Yes.
peer pressured people into donating to help these people out.
Yes, she was a strong, forthright woman.
And the Molly Brown house happens to be about 100 miles north of me. So if anybody comes into Colorado, I encourage everybody to stop in and check out the Molly Brown house, because there is so much Colorado history in that, in the connection. It's pretty cool.
And I happen to be in Leadville, Colorado right now, where Margaret and her husband struck it rich, in the old mining days. And it's really neat. The church is still up where they got married. And I'm a little disappointed they don't have a lot of mention over here. I'm like, come on, this is history of Leadville, People.
Yeah, Jill's a passenger person, so she tends to do that, and I'm more nuts and bolts. But I still love to hear the passenger stories. So
The passenger stories are always so powerful because we have that human connection.
exactly. I mean, you have to have the, if a ship is just a ship, but and the ship sinking like Titanic, it's just a ship until you start putting the people and the stories of the people, and especially now with the artifacts and how the artifacts are connecting to people, and it really makes the whole story more real. It really does. So, all righty, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you, everyone, and we will talk to you later.
All right. Thanks very much.